This unit is Unit 4, Learning. And this is a fun unit, I think. And it's a very conceptual unit rather than terms-based. If you go to the main page, AP Psych, then Learning, you'll land on this page here, and you can find what I'm going to be using. One of the really useful things, I think, is the Learning handout, which is this. I made this several years ago, but it basically includes everything from this entire unit, as well as definitions for all the terms. I think this is pretty helpful. But there are two main things we'll be learning about, and that is classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And then those kind of break down into more stuff, but that's the two main things. Classical conditioning is pairing two things together, an unconditioned stimulus and a conditioned stimulus, so that the unconditioned stimulus, Classical conditioning is pairing an automatic stimulus with a learned stimulus to make the response to the learned stimulus similar to the unconditioned stimulus. A lot of jargon, but you've all had the class anyway. So the main example that they use is Pavlov's dog. And in that example, which you're all familiar with, Pavlov was training a dog. Well, he wasn't actually training a dog at all. Pavlov was measuring the salivation response of a dog to food. Dogs automatically salivate to food. So in that example, the food, here, this is a good picture, sort of. The food is an unconditioned stimulus. All that means is it's a stimulus, a thing, that has an unconditioned or unlearned, an automatic response. So unconditioned stimulus just means a stimulus, in this case food, that has a response that doesn't have to be learned. It happens automatically. So if you see food, you also will, your salivary glands will start to produce saliva to digest the food, and dogs do the same thing. So that's the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, just meaning automatic. The word unconditioned could be replaced with automatic. Automatic stimulus, automatic response. But Pavlov noticed that whenever he went into the room to give the dog food, the dog would start salivating just when he entered the room. So actually that entering the room would then become a conditioned stimulus. So the dog ordinarily wouldn't react at all when a person enters a room unless it learns that that means that an unconditioned stimulus is about to come. And the dog learned that once Pavlov entered the room, food was about to come. So Pavlov's dog had a conditioned response, or meaning a learned response, to Pavlov entering the room, which would be a conditioned stimulus. Pavlov then, after realizing that the dog can learn that it can associate a novel response or a conditioned response with a neutral stimulus, he then saw if he could make a bell make a dog salivate, which ordinarily, of course, wouldn't happen. But then he rang a bell before giving the dog food, and the bell then became the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned or learned response to the bell was salivation. And that was the birth of classical conditioning. There's a few famous experiments. In fact, if you go to the website here, I have a lot of YouTube videos linked, which I don't want to play for copyright reasons, but you can see them here. There's the Little Albert experiment, which is about classical conditioning. John Watson did this, and he, in this video, got a baby Little Albert, they named him, and Little Albert was not afraid of white rats. Watson's goal in this kind of perverse experiment was to train Little Albert to become afraid of white rats using classical conditioning. So white rats then would be the neutral stimulus, so there's no associated response with white rat because the baby's not afraid. So he wanted to associate, by the way, classical conditioning is also called associative learning, or it's a type of associative learning, just meaning learning to associate two objects or experiences together. In order to make the baby afraid of white rats, Watson paired white rat, a neutral stimulus, with an unconditioned stimulus. In this case, he paired a naturally scary thing. He clanged a loud gong, which is the unconditioned stimulus, an automatic stimulus, which is automatically scary. So the loud gong, unconditioned stimulus, which has an automatic or unconditioned response of fear. He did that before presenting white rats, And then that made little Albert have a new conditioned or learned response to white rats of fear. So he successfully conditioned little Albert to be afraid of white rats. In this video here, this guy trains his roommate to be afraid of one of those Staples easy buttons. So he shoots his roommate, which would be an unconditioned stimulus because it has an automatic response of pain. But he shoots his roommate. But before he shoots his roommate, he does a neutral stimulus, an otherwise unconsequential stimulus. He presses the easy button and he says, that was easy. And then he shoots his roommate. And then the neutral stimulus of easy button unconsciously becomes associated with the unconditioned stimulus of being shot. And the neutral stimulus then becomes a conditioned stimulus, which has a conditioned response of fear or anticipation of being shot, so flinching. And there's the clip from The Office, and that's the conditioned stimulus part. So conditioned stimulus, just associating two objects together. And it goes in the order of unconditioned stimulus is the object which has an automatic response. Unconditioned response is the automatic response from the unconditioned stimulus. The neutral stimulus is an object that comes before the unconditioned stimulus, which ordinarily would have no response. The neutral stimulus, after it has been associated, becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response is the new learned response from the conditioned stimulus. That's the basics of classical conditioning. There's a few other terms that expand on that, some relating to therapy or deconditioning phobias. But extinction is when the conditioned stimulus is presented without the unconditioned stimulus, and then the conditioned stimulus stops giving the conditioned response. Or in other words, like with Pavlov, it would be if Pavlov kept ringing the bell, the conditioned stimulus, which the dog has learned that the bell means food is coming. But if you keep ringing the bell without giving food, at some point, extinction will occur, which just means that the conditioned stimulus stops giving the conditioned response. So if you keep ringing the bell and not giving the dog food, eventually the dog is going to stop salivating to the bell, and that would be extinction. Spontaneous recovery is after extinction has occurred. If you repair the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned stimulus will recover its conditioned response actually quicker than the first time. So if you extinguish the salivation response from the dog and the bell, say you ring the bell 20 days in a row without giving food, but on the 21st day you ring the bell and give the dog food again, then on the 22nd day, probably if you ring the bell, the dog is immediately going to go back into salivating to the sound of the bell. Phobia is an illogical or irrational fear of something. It's not just a fear, because a rational fear would not be a phobia. If you have a fear of a poisonous spider that is right in front of you, that's not necessarily a phobia. But a phobia would be if you can't touch a picture of a cartoon spider, like me. That would be a phobia, illogical or irrational. There are a few ways using classical conditioning to get rid of phobias. They both have to do with exposure therapy. One, and they all have to do with extinction. Because a phobia, almost by definition, is a conditioned stimulus that you've somehow associated with a negative experience. And so the conditioned stimulus of darkness or spiders or public speaking or whatever gives a conditioned response of that fear, which is irrational. So exposing it will cause extinction, which is a good thing in terms of phobias, or obsessive compulsive disorder, which works in a similar way. And there are two ways. If you expose all at once, that would be flooding. And if you expose gradually, that would be systematic desensitization, also called graduated exposure. To begin the exposure, often what a therapist would do would be to create a hierarchy of fears, which is a list of 1 to 10 of progressively more anxious invoking situations. So like if you're talking about clown phobias, number 1 would be something really easy to do with a clown, and number 10 would be something extremely anxiety provoking. So 1 might be, I want you to just think about a clown. That's pretty easy to do, even for someone that's afraid of clowns. Just thinking about the word clown, not that big of a deal. Number 10 would be like going into a circus tent with a clown in the tent. That would be almost the worst thing to do. Systematic sensitization would be to start with number 1, which is going to increase the anxiety to talk about a clown, and then you wait till the anxiety reduces a little bit, then you go on to number 2. Then that'll increase the anxiety, but your mind can't stay at a heightened anxiety level forever, so eventually it'll go down, then you move on to number 3, and so on. Flooding is you start with a relatively high anxiety situation and you just stay there, which is going to induce a high anxiety level, but eventually it'll go down and your body desensitizes to clowns or spiders or public speaking or whatever. Moving on to operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is shaping behavior or modifying behavior using rewards or punishment. That's all it is. So classical conditioning, associating two things together. Operant conditioning is making someone do something more often or less often based on rewarding them or punishing them. There are 4 possibilities for operant conditioning. It makes a little grid. And they are reinforcement or punishment, which just means if you're doing something pleasant or unpleasant in response to behavior. And then positive or negative, which does not mean good or bad. It just means if you're giving something or taking something away. So positive reinforcement would be giving a pleasant reward. Positive punishment would be giving an unpleasant stimulus. Negative reinforcement would be taking away something bad. The end result of reinforcement is it's going to increase the frequency of behavior, regardless of if it's positive or negative. And the end result of punishment is that it's going to decrease how often a behavior happens, regardless of if it's positive or negative. So for dogs, all 4 of these quadrants, positive reinforcement for a dog would be if the dog does something you want to increase, so you give it something nice. Like if a dog did something you like, you give it a treat, or you say, good boy. Both those would be positive reinforcement. Positive punishment would be if a dog does something you don't want it to repeat, then you would add something the dog doesn't like. Like you'd spray a dog with water, don't hit your dog. But hitting a dog would be positive punishment. Negative reinforcement is often the hardest quadrant to come up with examples. It's kind of the most obscure quadrant. But for a dog, negative reinforcement would be taking away something bad from a dog. Like if your dog does good with barking and you take away his bark collar, that would be negative reinforcement. Negative punishment would be taking away something that the dog enjoys to make it do something less often. So that would be like if your dog does something you don't like and then you take away the dog's toy, that would be negative punishment. That's all the types of reinforcement. That's how you reinforce. The schedules of reinforcement is when you reinforce. And there are, there's 4 ways you can reinforce, and then kind of a 5th way. Continuous at the bottom here just means you reinforce every single time. So if you're training your dog to sit so if you're training your dog to sit and you give him a treat every single time he sits, every single time, that would be continuous reinforcement, which, by the way, is a type of fixed ratio, but we'll talk about all 4 of these. Similar to the types of reinforcement, the schedules of reinforcement can be drawn on a grid, and they are fixed or variable, which just means if you know when the reinforcement is going to occur or it's predictable, and variable means it's random or you can't know when the reinforcement will occur. And then interval and ratio is if the reinforcement is based 100% on time. You doing something doesn't actually influence when the reinforcement occurs. The only thing that matters is just waiting, as opposed to ratio where something actually has to be done to trigger the reinforcement. So examples of fixed interval would be like the paycheck that I receive from school. It happens twice a month, every month. Now, with the assumption that I don't get fired, I will get paid twice a month. It doesn't even matter if I'm a good teacher, if I'm a bad teacher. With the one assumption that I don't get fired, I get paid twice a month. Also, holidays would work on a fixed interval schedule. And even the school bell schedule would work on a fixed interval schedule because you know first hour is over at 8:55 on a normal day. Variable interval. Variable interval is a reinforcement occurs after a random or unknowable amount of time. So weather is a good example of this, like tornadoes happen on a variable interval schedule. Even though the weather people sometimes say we'll probably have a tornado tomorrow, we still don't even know if it's going to happen or not, or exactly when it's going to happen. Fixed ratio includes continuous. So continuous means you get rewarded every single time after doing something. If a dog sits, you give it a treat every single time. Additionally, if you mow lawns, you probably get paid every single lawn you mow. But also, if you get paid after a predictable amount of, if you get like a bonus after a predictable amount of sales, that would also be fixed ratio. So you work at a shoe store, and after selling 100 pairs of shoes, you get a $100 bonus. It's a weird example, but that would still be fixed ratio because you don't get a bonus every pair of shoes you sell, which, by the way, would still be fixed ratio, but you get rewarded every 100th pair of shoes you sell, and that would be fixed ratio. Variable ratio. That would be you have to do something and you may or may not get rewarded. One common example of variable ratio would be gambling. So if you play the slot machines, you have to put money in and then you may or may not be rewarded for that and get money back. Also, asking people out on a date, you have to actually ask a person if they'll go on a date with you, and then they may or may not say yes. So that would still work as variable ratio. With operant conditioning, you can already existing behaviors you can increase or decrease by punishing or rewarding. But if you want to create novel behaviors, you can do that using, or at least link behaviors that already exist together. You can do that through shaping. So in that case, you would take a behavior that, let's say a dog already knows, and you would reward it when it gets closer to your target behavior. So target behavior is the behavior you eventually want the dog to be able to do, like turn over or fetch or whatever. And when the dog, you'd say fetch, and the dog doesn't know what that means because it's never learned that before. But once the dog does something that is in the direction of fetch, then you would reward the dog, say, good fetch. That's called successive approximations. So you have a target behavior and the dog can't do it perfectly the first time, but like with rollover, if the dog starts to sit down, it's getting closer to rollover. So you say, good rollover, and you'd reward the dog. And then once the dog laid down, you would reward the dog for laying down. You say, good rollover. And you'd no longer reward for just sitting down because that's farther away from rollover than laying down. Once the dog started to make a slight turn, you'd say, good rollover, and you'd no longer reward for just laying down, but you'd only reward for a partial roll. And you reward getting closer and closer and closer to your target behavior. And that's shaping using successive approximations. Chaining is linking individual behaviors in a total behavior. There's lots of videos on YouTube of dogs that can fetch things from the refrigerator to the owner, and you can't teach that in one fluid motion. You kind of have to train, open the refrigerator, and then bring something to the refrigerator, and multiple behaviors together. But if you link them all together, that would be called chaining. B.F. Skinner was the creator of operant conditioning, and he had what has since been called a Skinner box, although he called it an operant conditioning chamber. And it looked like this. It was a box that he put rats or pigeons, in his case usually pigeons, in, that had a lever where the rat or pigeon could press the lever and then immediately be reinforced. So Skinner would be able to train the animals very quickly because he could give them positive reinforcement for doing a behavior. So in this case, lever pressing behavior would be very quickly rewarded, which would increase the frequency using positive reinforcement of lever pressing behavior. He could also apply positive punishment, which not exactly ethical, but he could electrify the grid, making a painful electric shock on the feet of the pigeon or rat, and that would be positive punishment, adding an uncomfortable stimulus.